Thank you, Lily, and thank everyone for being here. Let's see, where's the thing? So I'm humbled and honored to speak after Tom Hayden, and you might be surprised I'm expressing humility since when the organizers of this asked me to have a presentation, I decided to present on what comes after capitalism. Surely a very humble endeavor. I blame my mentor and one of my inspirations, John Vandermeer, who, speaking about a particular mathematician, he said that he aspired someday to be as arrogant as that guy. So I don't think John's accomplished it, luckily, but maybe that's where I'm coming from. But thinking about why we're here, obviously this is a teach-in. This is the 50th anniversary of the teach-in that really helped spark the end of the Vietnam War. And as I think our next speaker is going to talk about, study is important if it leads to action. And so we're not just teaching, we're teaching and thinking and agitating about what's going to come next, what's already happening, how we're really going to mobilize and continue mobilizing to change the world, to change and address the problems that are facing us. When we think about the evidence-based future that Newt Nadelhofer talked about yesterday, or the evidence-based present that we would like to have, if we're just thinking about education and teaching and study, period, it would seem like, to some extent, we're sort of mission accomplished. We've got over half the American public believes or accepts the evidence of global climate change, and those who think it's happening are growing more certain, and those who do not are becoming less certain. And even if we think a little bit more partisanly, most Republicans say they back climate action, and a majority of Republicans support regulation of carbon dioxide as a pollutant. So we're done, right? We've sort of convinced the public, so why do we still have challenges? And this is why I would say that we need to think about other forms of evidence. We need to think as activists and as scholars and advocates about the evidence on how things change and what's going on with our system. And I would say I don't believe that we need a different system and system change. I would say I accept the evidence that we need a different system and system change. And so one example of this, in terms of thinking about political will, even though we have majorities that support climate action, this is a study from last year by Gillens and Page, and they found in terms of the preferences of average citizens and a correlation to around 1,800 policy issues that ended up with some kind of passage of a law, there was not a statistically significant relationship between the average voter's preferences and actual passage of laws. There were significant preferences, significant correlations with economic elites' preferences, which is the strongest, mass-based interest groups, and business groups, which are twice as powerful as mass-based interest groups. So we don't see a significant correlation between what the public wants and what's going to happen, and I think that is evidence we need to really internalize and work around, or work to change. So, looking at the Port Huron statement, there's just a great quote, many great quotes in it, but the vast majority of people regard the temporary equilibriums of our society and the world as eternally functioning parts, that we've arrived at the end of history, that capitalism and our current form of democracy is sort of the last thing we're going to have because it's the best. Or alternatively, that there is no alternative, that even if it's not the best, it's the best we can do. And so as grandiose a goal as changing the system might be, and as much as it might keep some of us up at night or keep us from getting out of bed in the morning worrying about, well, how are we going to tackle changing the system that's so big, I think we also need to be reassured and accept the evidence of the fact that systems always change. If we have any view of history, the likelihood that capitalism and our current democracy are the last system we develop is practically nil. We know that capitalism is going to end and something else will come in its place. And we have the potential to make that good. So I think if we accept the evidence, we can accept the evidence that this is not the system that we're stuck with. The evidence is that we can change it, and that I think we should take that into account and be energized by that part of it. But we do have to face right now that we have these problems, and so I think talking about political action and political will, I think we shouldn't be surprised that there aren't more people who are activated about climate, though it's growing and it's exciting and it's great. But if we think about Black Lives Matter, if we think about the people who've been killed by police action over the past year and many, many years, most white Americans don't believe that it has a racial cause. We have people who are out in the streets literally over life and death issues, and they aren't seeing the action that they need and they want. And so if you have something that today is life and death, and you can't get the reaction you want from the government, how are we going to expect people to get involved and think about something that's a little bit more abstract, a little bit more in the future, though also in the present, but not as visceral. We need to think about not just how to get people active around climate, but how we can join these different movements and ideas, just like Amy Goodman talked about yesterday, as I think Harvey Wasserman addressed yesterday in the rally, as Tom was talking about. We need to look at social justice and all these other issues, and we can't just think about our issue, but also about solidarity, not just because I think it's really important and justice is important beyond climate justice, but people aren't going to trust us in terms of we need to have action on this if we don't show up for people who are dying right now. I think even as scholars or professors or whatever we are, we can't, if we want change, confine ourselves to our areas of expertise, because people don't trust people who say, well, that's your problem, I'm going to do mine. So there's another quote from the Port Huron statement, that the American voter worried about their mundane problems which never get solved, ends up constrained by the common belief that politics is an agonizingly slow accommodation of views and equips all pretense of bothering. This is why we need to get involved with other struggles, because this isn't even a mundane problem, a problem of being killed by cops, and numerous other problems that face us. It's not at all mundane, and so if we don't help people with action towards these problems, how can we expect them to show up for other ones? So I think there's two explanations that tie together why we haven't seen more action, though as I said, it is exciting that it's growing, and I think we are seeing not just growing understanding of the science, but growing activity around it. But we're in a system that doesn't reward involvement, and indeed, I would say punishes involvement in a variety of ways, from tear gassing protests to just the fact that, oh, well, you're going to that hippie thing, right? Oh, yeah. Going to change the world, yeah. It's a punish. People chastise you sometimes for being involved. And beyond this discouragement directly, I'd say that we have a narrative that theorizes against us being involved directly, against us being a catalyst for change. And this is capitalism that theorizes that we shouldn't even be involved. The best result will be from all of us pursuing our self-interest without thinking about how to work together. So, at the core of many economic models, capitalist economic models, is homo economicus, or economic man. No longer being wise man or homo sapiens, we're economic man. And there's a great quote from the statistician and economist Cosmo Shilizi that if an economic man has an unsatiated demand for potato chips, and the cost of one more potato chip will be devastate innumerable millions, he's not equipped to care. I actually wanted to have some potato chips so I could eat them for a prop, but I forgot that. But and he goes on further to say, in terms of economic efficiency or Pareto optimality, it says, well, who are we to judge? That's preferences. You want to eat potato chip and it kills other people, it's not really, the job of the model. Now, economists, I think, correctly point out, well, that's just a model. We're not saying that's exactly the truth. And something that I've learned from John and then from Dick Levins as well, from other mentors, is that, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So maybe we shouldn't give too much flack for this model. Well, I'd say that we do need to keep into account, though, that models shape how we see the world, especially when they're so dominant. And so if we have, a kid that's, for example, played with flying cars that traveled through time all the time, that's the only car he ever saw, was this model car that traveled through time, you'd have to forgive him for thinking Back to the Future was a documentary. You can't just have one model and then say, well, it's just a model. You have to actually be more open and talk about other alternatives if you want people to have a view of the world that's more expansive. So in my humility, I proposed some ideas that might come after capitalism or homo ecocommensalism. I've been told by anyone who's ever heard the word marketing that this is not a really catchy word, but this is a larval idea, so bear with me. So I think the realization that we're all seated at the same table, which is commensalism, alongside the idea that we're all living in the same household, is what we need to focus on. And I've got some specific ideas within that, but to break it down, commensalism for the ecologist and non-ecologist in the audience, the basic idea is an organism that benefits from something and another organism in the same interaction has no effect. It's not really helped or harmed. So you've got this spider and an impala's horns, and the spider gets a habitat, and what does the impala care? It's not really hurt or harmed by that. Or taking the metaphor more literally, co-mensal, same table. So the idea is we have this great Ethiopian meal that maybe I like chickpeas, you like spinach, someone else likes corn. So I take the corn, but that doesn't hurt or help you. You don't care. That's not the part you're eating. So I leave the things that you want to eat and someone likes soggy injera, and so they get the last bit, and everyone's happy. So neither hurt nor helped. And then the ecology portion comes from the Greek oikos, the household, and so ecology is the study of the household or the earth, and economics is the management of the household. I would say the biosphere, the earth in this case, is how it should be viewed at least. And so the idea of eco-commensalism is that both these things are true, that we're in the same household, at the same table, and what we do affects everyone else there. That we exist in a really complex, multi-scale, teleconnected web of many relationships. And so, like I said, what you do, as we know, in your household affects the other people in your household. You can't get away from that. Those of you who are students might think of it the fact that your roommates affect what's happened to you. And a lot of these relationships are largely non-market. You can't just put a price on wearing pants in front of parents. That how we affect each other is profoundly beyond simply how we price things. If we want to be more pedantic than these examples, a recent study said that organic agriculture has twice the non-market value of conventional agriculture. There's not a market for the services in not causing climate change and not causing health problems for workers. And arguably setting up a market for that wouldn't be the best approach to do it. So we need to think about the fact that we're surrounded by non-market interactions, and so even though you can stretch capitalism to encompass some things, maybe we shouldn't try and stretch an idea that wasn't meant to encompass that, and rather think about other ideas. We also have a really complex minivariable world that requires social arrangements that are really dynamic and adaptable. And so to get more jargony, I think one of the things that's really promising here is work on subsidiarity and polycentricity. Said really simply, the idea that decisions should be made at the most local level possible, and that the power should be located at the most local level possible. Not just you can make a decision that on paper then gets funded maybe from the state government or from farther up. So Elinor Ostrom and her husband Vincent Ostrom were really influential in thinking about this. And Elinor Ostrom is very well known for her work in common property resources on showing how local level institutions can really provide sustainable governance of resources for hundreds of years in some cases. And so she equipped before she died that in some cases you could say, or in some ways you could say that climate change is an easier problem than the one that she looked at, because she was looking at irrigation with thousands of farmers in Spain and Nepal and India, and these thousands of individuals who, if you work with farmers, just like nation states, they're kind of stubborn and can be headstrong and know a lot, but it can be hard to change their mind or get them to do something. But thousands of farmers cooperated successfully for hundreds of years to have these irrigation problems. There's only 200 or so countries, so in a way, it's easier than what she's already shown works. To be a little bit more serious, people have pointed out that, well, this is a limited set of cases. We can't extrapolate to everything from the fact that Ostrom did these certain cases and her colleagues have done them. But by the same hand, I wouldn't say any other system of governance has had this level of empirical validation. If we're going to be evidence-based, what's the evidence using thousands of case studies as she did, and game theory and economics, that other systems of governance work better? I would say that this is the most evidence-based system of governance we can think of in terms of strong local institutions. And so we should be thinking about how to encourage and support that, rather than thinking about how to work around it or assume that it's not the best because we don't have all the evidence yet. And this is what eco-commensalism is about, is finding more of these rules and ideas. Because the ability and tendency of humans to cooperate, it's idiosyncratic, it varies, but there's patterns. And I would say that neither of these are really predicted by or encompassed in the way we do economics right now. So another thing that Ostrom said before she died is that she thought of the way we could think about cooperation is that there could be a grammar of cooperation, that languages vary immensely, are very different around the world, but there's underlying structures that are similar. And so we can think about this as a grammar of how people get along and the rules that allow us to work together. And so I'd say exploring that grammar, which I would not say is a capitalist project, should be one of our projects for the future. And we should remember in doing this that there's a huge importance on meaning and identity. Akerlof and Cranton said, because identity is so fundamental to behavior, you could argue that it's the most important economic decision people make, but it's not a classic economic capitalist decision what identity you're going to take on. But if we think about it, it fundamentally shapes who we are and what we do. After all, we're here to celebrate something 50 years ago that was really important. We're taking our time to be here. The teach-in logo is in maize and blue for Michigan. Tom was playing against our prejudices against Ohio State. These are things of identity. If we're just talking about market, why would we care? We shouldn't care. We're not just market entities. We care about identity, who we are, and what we're doing, and that's a huge source of potential power for the movement and has been for movements in the past. And so we can't forget that, ignore it, or I'd say not study it. There's also, I would say, in terms of the evidence, the important fact that face-to-face interactions, it doesn't seem like they can be replaced. Seeing someone across from you and working with them is very different than calling them or seeing them over Skype or what have you. And I would say part of this is the fact that much of what we know arguably is still evidence-based, but it's tacit. We can't express it. And so as important as the science is, and as much as I love science, I'd say the science says that it's not enough because we can't possibly list all of the information and assumptions we need for all problems. And so to be dynamic and responsive, I think we need to think about more ways to foster face-to-face communication in our democracy, in our interactions, because all the information that we carry and how we carry ourselves, our body language, how we act, going to dinner together, supping together, that those are all really important things that allow us to cooperate and that we undervalue right now. So this sounds pretty challenging because we can't all just be one big 7 billion person, go in the door and vote with our hands. I'd say that there's also another part attached to this that's hopeful. There's lots of research on what's called weak ties and other network connections that people that you see occasionally or that you have weak ties to actually can be very influential. Acquaintances are very influential on, in the classic studies, on how you get jobs, how you communicate information. That basically acquaintances by definition know people you don't, and most of their social circle is a circle you don't know. And so it's not that everyone has to be face-to-face, but we need more of that, so there's more of these sort of hubs, these people who are our acquaintances that connect us, and I think can build important things like sort of transitive trust, that we trust people our acquaintances trust if we trust our acquaintance. And so that gives us a little bit more ability to have a participatory democracy that's not everyone talking to everyone, but more of us being involved, so that at least we know someone who's directly involved. And there's also just really interesting innovations right now, in I'd say innovations in democracy, like I would say capacity building and identity building through rotation. The International Small Farmers Movement, La Via Campesina, has millions of farmers around the world they work with, and 80 to 100 organizations. When they were founded almost 30 years ago, they had a very Latin America focus, they still do, and La Via Campesina, it's Spanish, the farmer's way, the peasant's way. And this was something that was viewed as a problem by many of their members who are not from Latin America in terms of identity. One of the things that they decided to do to respond to that and take that seriously is that they now rotate the secretariat, the headquarters, the center of power or decision-making in Via Campesina goes from region to region. So for many years it was in Indonesia after being in Latin America, and it had an Indonesian international coordinator, Henry Sirag. And now it's in Africa, in Zimbabwe. It has the first woman international coordinator, Elizabeth Mpofu. And this sharing of authority, of the actual space of authority, is really, I think, interesting and important, and an innovation that at least I hadn't thought of before. And while at the same time, maybe it's not practical to move the U.S. Capitol every 4 years or 8 years, there's also maybe things we can learn from this example and be creative in ways of applying it. And then the last of the tenets I just made up in the past couple of days is that I think self and communal efficacy has to be fostered, that we have to have spaces where people believe that they can make an impact, and they do make an impact, that their deliberation does change the way things are done. Because the narrative of capitalism is sort of anti-deliberation, that in terms of bettering society, you shouldn't get together and talk with your friends and make an agreement on how to better society. You should just look after your own self-interest, and that will make everyone better off in the long term. That consciously trying to make decisions as a group democratically is not necessarily the way capitalism is theorized to run. So we need new theories and new narratives and new interactions to foster these relationships. And so this is a graph from another, or a figure from another colleague of Elinor Ostrom, just looking at the different ways you can interact or think about how trust and cooperation interact. And I think just for our purposes here, an important part to look at is net benefit, that the benefit feeds back into everything and feeds back into those relationships of trust. And so when we ally with groups or we organize things, if there's not a way for that power to be translated, then we can lose the trust that we need to build. And so we need to think about effective tools of power to work together so that we can maintain that trust. And I would say that this is possibly part of why we see some of the resistance that we do see, that even though a majority of Republicans support action on climate change, as you can see in this graph, a majority of them don't think that they actually can affect change. And it's a question whether or not that's a cause or an effect or a co-correlate. But I would say that this is part of what we often see, that people don't believe that even if they did do something, it would affect a change. And I think from that work from Gillens and Page, that's not an unreasonable belief. So I've talked pretty grandiose, big ideas. I think that the exciting thing beyond Via Campesina is there's lots of examples of people doing things different ways and utilizing these different methods that we can build on, that we can think about the next system or the next kind of democracy we have and build on that. And I would say the evidence is that we need to embrace these new kinds of democracy in order to solve our problems. And so one example is my organization, IATP. We've organized Rural Climate Dialogue. We had the first one in Morris, Minnesota, where 15 citizens for a citizens jury were selected at random, but representative of different slices of the population. So across economic status, across race and gender. And they sat and they talked about climate and how that would affect their community. And there are very different people. There's at least one gentleman who felt sort of politically like he was very different from everyone else. And he called to thank Anna Clausen, our director of this program, for involving him at the end. In the middle, he was kind of like, I'm not sure if I should even be here. But by the end, he was thanking us. And I'm not sure if it was the same gentleman or a different one who said, I wasn't sure what to expect. I thought it'd be a bunch of people who were very adamant about this topic and we wanted to get together and say hurrah about it. I was very impressed with this group's ability to come together as community members, as neighbors, and talk about these things in an open, civil, and friendly manner. So people do change their minds, but we need to do more than just trying to argue with them. We also see participatory budgeting, which is a process that was first developed in Porto Alegre, Brazil, where essentially you start with neighborhood assemblies and they decide what it's open to everyone, what the priorities for funding are in their neighborhood. They vote delegates from that assembly up to a city level council. That council decides on what the citywide priorities are. It goes back to the community for final ratification, and it goes to the mayor, who can say yes or no. So basically it's just that you have these neighborhood communities that vote up a delegate from that community, which if you think about, well, how is that different than representative democracy? For one thing, it's people coming from that meeting, people who've built trust in that actual meeting. And you see the results, actually, the proof is in the pudding. In Porto Alegre, 35% of the council members were women, 34% were low income, and 20% had no high school education. So, I mean, think about where else do you see that? Do you see that in the city council? Do you see the actual population represented in a representative democracy? And I would say you don't. So this is a different kind of way of doing things, and one that's been shown to work in many cases, and we can keep refining. So there's the expression that another world is possible, and I just like to say and think that, given what we see already happening, and many more examples besides the ones I just gave, that actually another world is already here, and we just need to embrace it and build on it and think about it and talk about it and work with it. Thank you.